All right, we are back with part 4 of our series on President Nixon and the Watergate scandal.
Woo! I'm equal parts excited to hear the ending and excited for you to be done with this because I know it's been just an insane amount of work to put these episodes together.
Yeah, I am also glad it's over, and I hope you guys have really enjoyed it. And I also want to thank our listeners for your patience on this series. It's unfortunate but true that Harley and I do have day jobs and hosts of other obligations. So sometimes when you have these really meaty cases, it takes a little bit longer.
But hopefully the listeners like you will help us turn this into a full-time gig and we can get you content even faster.
Guys, rate 5 stars, like, share, tell your
Mhm.
friends, please.
Yep, if you got impatient waiting for Watergate, you know what to do.
Yeah. And before we dive in, I'd like to give one more final shout out to my favorite author of all times, Garrett Graff, who wrote the book Watergate: A New History, which I relied on heavily for this series. It's like a 600-page book. He covers it all, and if you want to know more about what actually went down in those couple of years of the Watergate scandal, you definitely should pick up and read that book. But sit back and relax because I'm taking you back in time to April 29th, 1973.
She's Sarah.
She's Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress. So the last time we talked, Nixon had just gotten rid of pretty much all of his entire inner circle in the White House, who had played a role in the covering up of the White House involvement in the Watergate break-in and related other dirty tricks, right? So if you remember, Nixon got rid of or saw the resignation of his chief of staff, Bob Hadelman, his top aide, John Ehrlichman, his counsel who had led the cover-up efforts, John Dean, and his attorney general, Richard Kleindienst. There were, of course, many others who also resigned or were fired between the White House and the campaign. But those are really the standout ones that I think you need to know about. On April 30th, Nixon addressed the nation to announce these departures and a new attorney general named Elliot Richardson, who actually took a step down from his position as a Secretary of Defense to become AG. Richardson overall saw his new role as an opportunity to restore public trust in the law enforcement process. Getting Richardson Senate confirmed, though, unsurprisingly, didn't happen without a few kinks. Essentially, to get confirmed, Richardson had to agree to appoint a special independent prosecutor to investigate the Watergate scandal. After struggling to get someone to take the job, a man named Archibald Cox agreed to take on the challenge. Now, Cox had served in 3 Democratic presidents over the course of his career, including as Solicitor General of the Kennedy administration. And then he had also gone on to be a tenured professor at Harvard. While Cox did not have a ton of trial experience, Richard thought he had integrity, which, considering the subject matter and timing, was ideal. The major thing to know about Cox's new gig was the fact that only A.G. Richardson could fire him, and he could only fire Cox for quote unquote extraordinary improprieties. Back at the White House, Nixon welcomed General Alexander Haig Jr., who had served as top aide for Henry Kissinger as his new chief of staff. Haig recruited J. Fred Bushart to be the White House's legal counsel and Melvin Laird to essentially fill the role that Ehrlichman had left behind. As a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox had his work cut out for him. There was a lot of catching up to do. It had been close to a year since the fateful night at the Watergate complex, and while the burglars had been convicted, there remained 1,000 different questions about how the White House had obstructed justice and tried to pull off this massive cover-up. While doing some groundwork, Cox and his team chatted with Assistant AG Henry Peterson about the case. While Peterson was very defensive, he ended up admitting that the infamous come to Jesus conversation that Nixon had with John Dean about the entirety of the Watergate plot was recorded. But Peterson quickly followed up with, I didn't want to hear it though.
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting that you wouldn't, yeah, I guess you don't want to self-incriminate yourself, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And
maybe just he wanted the benefit of ignorance. What's that? Oh, ignorance is bliss.
ignorance is
But you
bliss.
don't know can't hurt you.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's just knowing, I think the conversation was recorded, I think was probably enough for him. He's like, I don't want to, which we'll kind of see as a pattern as we go along today's episode.
Which is interesting because he's the one who wanted everything recorded in the first place.
Yeah, correct. In a meeting between Cox and Nixon's legal team, Cox brought up the fact that this conversation was recorded on tape. Nixon's legal team at the time included Fred Buzzhart, Leonard Garment, and Charles Allen Wright. Garment was the president's personal White House counsel, while Buzzhart solely focused on Watergate. Wright had been brought in to focus on the constitutional and presidential powers aspect of the Watergate case. But back to the tape. During the meeting, Buzzhart relayed that they would not turn over the tape and that it was actually a recording of Nixon's recollections of the conversation, so not the actual conversation itself. Cox doubted that, and ultimately it would be revealed at a minimum Buzzhart misled the special prosecutor's team.
Yeah, that sounds very convenient.
Yeah, oh, it was just the president recollecting what they talked about. Sure. Meanwhile, over in the Senate, the Watergate hearings are happening. Remember, these hearings were broadcasted live, so the entire country was learning in real time all the dirty tricks that we've been talking about for the past couple episodes. Not only were the hearings live on TV, but they were also rebroadcasted in the evening in full or gavel to gavel. The hearings would ultimately see 63 witnesses across 53 days, and the average American home watched around 30 hours of the hearing, which, when you really think about it, is a lot of hours.
That's a comms director dream for a hearing.
Right?
I would love it. Can you imagine? I mean, truthfully, I don't even watch them all. I can't even get myself to sit through them, all of them, gavel to gavel.
Can I tell you a secret? Same, yeah.
I see the highlights on Punch Bowl. I watch my boss speak, and I'm out of there.
You're like, that's good. What more do I need?
Exactly. Jake Sherman's going to tell me everything I need to know tomorrow anyway.
Exactly. So these Senate hearings were substantial and started on May 17th, 1973. But things really started to kick into high gear on June 25th when John Dean himself testified. Dean's opening statement was 245 pages, and it took him a total of 6 hours to read.
I'm surprised they didn't recess during that, or maybe they did. They probably did have to recess during that.
Yeah, I think he had to, but I remember reading something that he was sucking on like cough drops essentially the whole time, to make sure that his voice was sounding clear, which I can imagine. I mean, we do this for, an hour or so, and after that I'm like, wow, that was a lot of talking.
I know. My brain, we're batching some recordings today, giving you a little peek behind the curtain. And I'm tired. And it's been like, what, an hour and a half? So I can only imagine.
6 hours?
And this isn't live either.
Right. It's not live. And also, I'm not talking about crimes that I committed. So I can imagine that's even harder. But over the course of his testimony, Dean copped to obstructing justice, encouraging perjury, and money laundering. He also outlined 6 different conversations between him and the president that indicated that Nixon was aware and involved in the cover-up. That's a huge deal. Because up until then, there was this guise that perhaps Nixon wasn't really involved in the misconduct and it had been his senior staff all along. Dean was the first witness to say, actually, no, Nixon himself is in on this and knows about it.
I am always very skeptical of this idea that the principal knows nothing and it's just the senior staff. With like the tiny bit of information and experience I've had with principals and their senior staff, there's not much that's kept hidden.
Right. And especially when you have a boss like Nixon who is, paranoid and kind of, a manager, has to know, there's no way that something of this magnitude, right, would go on without, with his eyes closed, without him knowing about it.
And if something is going on that they don't know about, they probably know that there's something going on that they don't know about.
Right. Exactly. My staffers are acting weird.
Although, granted, they didn't have Outlook at this time. And so maybe there was a little bit more separation and autonomy between the members and the staff.
He couldn't look and see that people were meeting at the same time on Teams.
Yeah. You couldn't just drop an AirTag in your boss's purse.
Yeah. Unfortunate. So, in addition to his testimony, Dean also submitted dozens of documents as supporting evidence, including Nixon's political enemies list, which included journalists, professors, members of Congress, the president of the United Auto Workers, and even actor Paul Newman himself. One reporter named Daniel Swore read the list live on national television and found himself reading his name out loud. Can you imagine?
Crazy. You know that if this were happening today, he would have that in his like Bumble profile or as like his Twitter bio, like Nixon's political enemy.
Well, and you know what's funny too? I read something that Paul Newman said that he was like, it was the best accomplishment of my entire career was ending up on Nixon's political enemies list.
Yeah. Do you remember? I guess it was a couple years ago now when Russia sanctioned all of these members of Congress after invading Ukraine, and it was a badge of honor to be sanctioned by Russia. Yeah. So it has to be somewhat similar. I mean, not comparing Nixon to Russia, but
no. Another important element about Dean's testimony is that it was thought to be highly credible by both Congress and the public. In fact, polls showed that 70% of Americans believed John Dean. House Majority Leader Tip O'Neill was struck by all that Dean had said and recalled that as being the catalyst to prompt the later impeachment hearings. It was also around this time that a secret meeting took place between staffers at the Senate Watergate Committee and the House Judiciary Committee about a hypothetical collaboration on a hypothetical impeachment inquiry. After Dean's testimony, the Senate committee requested certain documents from the White House, but received a letter back refusing the request and claiming that the constitutional separation of powers and executive privilege prevented him from releasing those documents. Meanwhile, Buzz Hart, Nixon's counsel, focused on Watergate, listening to the White House tapes to develop a defense, and quickly saw that things were way worse than he expected. He later confided in White House aide Melvin Laird, saying, "The president was involved in the cover-up. I've listened to some of the tapes, and he was in on the cover-up right up to his eyeballs from the beginning." So now we're in July 1973, and this is when a major bombshell is dropped. While the Senate hearings were ongoing, Senate investigators were making their way through a list of more peripheral characters of the White House, and they ended up doing an interview with a man named Alexander Butterfield, who had been a deputy assistant to the president and Hadelman's chief of staff. Butterfield also oversaw the installation of Nixon's taping system in the Oval Office and his office in the Executive Office Building. At this time, no one except Nixon, Hadelman, Butterfield's assistant, and 3 or 4 Secret Service technical staffers knew about the installation of the recording system. This was all about to change. Butterfield's initial interview with the Senate investigators was so low profile that no senators were even present. The investigators ended up asking Butterfield, why would the president take John Dean to a certain corner of the Oval Office to have a sensitive conversation? Butterfield's response was, quote unquote, "I was hoping you fellows wouldn't ask me that. I've wondered what I would say. I'm concerned about the effect my answer will have on national security and international affairs. But I suppose I have to assume that this is a formal official interview in the same vein as if I were being questioned by the committee under oath." "That's right," said the investigator. "Well, yes, there's a recording system in the White House." This was a game changer. The Senate committee staffers worked fast over the weekend to have Butterfield publicly testify about the recording device the following week. Butterfield, for his part, wanted them to subpoena someone else, but the lawyer said no dice. On Sunday night, Butterfield called Lynn Garment at the White House to tell him what he planned to say. Garment had no idea about the tapes, and the chief of staff, Haig, rushed to shut down the operation immediately. So that is kind of when the recording system stopped.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm very surprised he didn't just plead the fifth on that question.
I don't know, right? Like, did he want? I think I think he felt maybe it was right to say that there was. I don't know. Yeah.
They didn't have to convince him that hard. He was at least okay with it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I'm hoping you fellows won't ask me that, but I'm going to say it. Mm-hmm. So remember, up until that point, investigators only had Dean's testimony that pointed the finger at Nixon. With the existence of these tapes, there could be compelling proof that Nixon himself actually did know about it. So Special Prosecutor Cox knew this, and he knew that Nixon would not give up those tapes without a fight. And there would be a fight over powers and privileges of the president. But they had to start somewhere. And luckily, they already had a very helpful tool that the Nixon team had begrudgingly sent over earlier. This was the president's daily diaries from June 15th, 1972 to April 30th, 1973. This gave a minute-by-minute log of Nixon's movement. Using this log, it would be easier to nail down the exact dates and times of the tapes to ask for them. On July 18th, Cox sent a letter to Buzzhart asking for 8 specific tapes. Senator Sam Ervin and Howard Baker also called upon the president to release the tapes to the Senators Committee.
What was the reaction of Nixon and his team?
Great question. Nixon was both disgusted and horrified that a once loyal aide like Butterfield would up and tell the public about his recording system. The question was, though, what to do with the tapes? Buzzhart and Nixon's VP Spiro Agnew offered up the idea to destroy the tapes, while Garment voiced that even destroying the tapes would certainly prompt an obstruction of justice charge and an impeachment proceeding. At the end of the day, it seems that Nixon ultimately wanted the tapes kept and unharmed out of the hope that A, the tapes would somehow prove his innocence, and that B, would show Nixon was a good president after all in the history books.
I mean, it's hard to have something prove a falsehood when it's recording something in real time. But okay. It's like you rob a bank and then you're like, I hope there was CCTV footage. Maybe there's something in there that will prove my innocence.
Right, exactly. It's like you knew what you said though. So why would you ever think that it would prove your innocence and that John Dean was lying when you know he wasn't? Like the delusion is high on this one.
Mm-hmm.
That next Monday, Haig ended up calling A.G. Richardson to tell him that there would be no turning over the tapes and said, the president is uptight about Cox. He wants a tight line drawn. No further mistakes or we'll get rid of Cox. So that's the president's chief of staff calling the AG, asking them that, basically threatening that they're going to fire the special prosecutor, who again is supposed to be this independent entity that can only be fired by the AG for extraordinary improprieties.
I want to say that's insane, but with some recent presidential actions we've seen in this arena, I'm almost not even shocked. Like, yeah, of course that's where this would go next.
Yeah, maybe not so crazy after all. So from Nixon and his legal team POV, I guess you could say, Cox didn't even have a standing to request the tapes, since at the end of the day, he was a Justice Department employee, so the president's decision overruled. In this case, Garrett Graff described their defense by saying this. This was just a routine workplace dispute, unreviewable by the court, in the same way that an assembly line worker can't sue the factory owner simply because he doesn't like the boss's decision. Except
this is the country and not a private business.
Right.
Okay.
Anyways, go on. Once Nixon officially refused the request for tapes from both Cox and the senators, both sides issued subpoenas to the President of the United States. Nixon obviously rejected both orders, setting the stage for the case to be taken to the Supreme Court. But it doesn't go that way. Not quite yet. Also want to point out at this time too, the scandal didn't just stop at Watergate, because in August of 1973, Maryland's U.S. Attorney George Beall notified Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew that he was the target of an investigation into his alleged bribery scheme. Turns out, Agnew had received $1,000 a week in kickbacks for 6 years as Baltimore County executive and Maryland governor. He had also taken around $50,000 in payments as VP. It was a pretty open and shut case, and despite Agnew's blatant lies denying the whole affair, he would end up resigning from office and plead no contest to one felony charge, tax evasion, on October 10th, 1973. So the whole administration is just
fallen apart at the seams.
Riddled. Yeah, riddled.
Menendezing left, right, every direction.
Menendezing. But back to August and the fight for the tapes. Senior judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, John Sirica, who you may remember from last episode, was still presiding. The question on the table was whether the subpoena asking the president to turn over the tape recordings was enforceable. Nixon's legal team, led by Mr. Wright, argued that the president was exempt from a subpoena, citing executive privilege, and that the contents of the tape could jeopardize national security. He also argued that only the president could determine what was privileged information and what was not. Special Prosecutor Cox argued that executive privilege was not absolute authority and that there was strong reason to believe that the integrity of the executive office had been corrupted, although the extent of the rot was not clear, end quote. By late August, Judge Sirica had made his decision. He ordered that the president turn over the tapes to him so he could listen and determine what may or may not be considered privileged. Neither the Nixon team or Cox loved the outcome, so Nixon and his team decided to not comply with the order and appeal the judge's decision, naturally.
Trump v. United States, I wonder if that would have changed the outcome of this ruling. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know enough about the ins and outs of executive privilege and whatnot, but kind of interesting that things could be potentially be completely different if this were happening today.
Yeah, totally. Because it wasn't that case, essentially, if it's an official action, right? And so it's like, I mean, it was in the Oval Office, but I guess doesn't necessarily make it, an official act. I don't know.
Although it just depends on how they define official. Because if they have defined official as non-political, then this is absolutely official, because you can't do anything that's not anything political from the Oval Office. Granted, that's broken all the time, but that's the rule.
Yeah, right.
However, if they define official as just something as president and like your personal life, a call with your grandma or something doesn't count, then maybe there's some more room there, but super interesting.
Very interesting. And this is all us just talking about a case that we really haven't talked very deeply.
Yeah, no. So if you're a lawyer, let us know, but we're going to continue to speculate.
Tell us where we're wrong. So before the U.S. Appeals Court issued their decision, they actually asked the Nixon team and Cox to try to work out a deal on their own. Cox offered that the Nixon team could hand over partial transcripts double-checked by a third party who could testify that the remaining excerpts were irrelevant to the case. Ultimately, the Nixon team rejected that deal. Also during this time, it's worth noting that Cox and his team weren't just going after Nixon. His team, in fact, was making progress on all fronts, serving indictments for many members of the greater Nixon team and securing guilty pleas from big companies like American Airlines for making illegal contributions to the Nixon re-election campaign.
That's why I fly Delta.
For that reason, exactly. I remember.
Yep, absolutely. Where were you?
Yeah, where were you? Not even a twinkle in my parents' eye. On October 12th, 1973, the D.C. District Court of Appeals upheld Judge Sirica's ruling 5-2, finding that, quote unquote, the federal court had jurisdiction to resolve the dispute that presidents are not absolutely immune to grand jury subpoenas, and that courts may rule on matters related to executive privilege. That same night, Nixon called up House Minority Leader Gerald Ford to ask him to be his new vice president. This was the first time the 25th Amendment was being enacted, which says that whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both House and Congress. Nixon picked Ford for two reasons. One, he was popular, and two, he wasn't a real leader. Those items together would make it very easy for Ford to be confirmed.
But why would Ford even want this job at this point with where Nixon's reputation is?
That's a good question. Duty, I think, perhaps. And also, I mean, you will see, I don't really talk about this a ton, but Nixon was very far removed from all of this scandal, and like purposefully so. He really was, until he like pardoned Nixon. Oh, spoiler alert. You'll see that he's arm's length. But I mean, he was the House Minority Leader too. So I mean, natural choice, for Nixon. And but yeah, I don't know.
Interesting.
Well, yeah. Would you say yes?
Yeah, I have no idea.
After the Court of Appeals handed down their decision, Nixon had 5 days to come to an agreement on turning over the tapes to Cox or appeal to the Supreme Court. But simply put, Nixon was not ready to hand any wins over to Cox. In fact, it was the very opposite. That Monday morning after the appeals court decision, A.G. Richardson was called into the White House for a meeting with Nixon's chief of staff, Haig, and top aide Buzzard. As pulled from Graf's book, the Nixon staffer laid out a pretty unbelievable plan. Quote unquote, the president would prepare transcripts of the tape, authenticate them, and deliver them to Judge Sirica, allowing the investigation to proceed. Then he would fire Cox to negate the appeals court case in order to turn over the case themselves and end the controversy. Richard's response? He said, I'd have to resign.
Who was the third party who would validate the tapes?
So this would be Senator John Stennis, a Democrat from Mississippi who served in the Senate for over 41 years. He was well respected and had a strong reputation for integrity. However, the Nixon team really envisioned that Buzzard would summarize the tapes and Stennis would simply sign off. Also worth noting that Stennis was famously hard of hearing, and the tapes weren't of the best quality, full of background noises, which made it really hard to understand what folks were saying at times.
Is that partially why he was chosen, or was this like, you have to follow the rule? Okay, so there's not like a set person that would.
No, there was no set person. This was the Nixon's camp's decision.
Oh, poor Stennis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the proposal also had a few stipulations, including that if accepted, Cox could not seek any further presidential records. Thinking that perhaps Cox would agree to this based on his earlier proposal before the Court of Appeals' final decision, Richardson presented the final proposal to Cox. Cox weighed the pros and the cons of the proposal. Some of the pros included avoiding the risk of a constitutional crisis and impeachment hearings, while the cons included the idea that the transcripts would be absolutely useless and they would be back at square one. Cox ended up rejecting the proposal, prompting Nixon's team to tell A.G. Richardson that he needed to fire Cox. Richardson then did some soul searching at home after his meeting and determined that he would have to resign in protest to the order to fire Cox. He took his vow to only fire Cox for egregiously unreasonable actions seriously, and Cox refusing the Stennis proposal was not that, he decided.
I have to agree with him on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. On Friday, October 19th, 1973, the day of Nixon's deadlines for appealing to the Supreme Court, Cox received a letter from Nixon's lawyer Wright that summarized a call between him and Cox the night before. Except Wright twisted the truth and made it seem like Cox was the unreasonable one for rejecting the Stennis proposal, and did not mention the stipulations that, in Cox's mind, made the proposal a piece of garbage. The showdown on the Stennis proposal made it clear to everyone that something bad was about to happen. Staffers in the special prosecutor's office scrambled to place sensitive documents in lock boxes and other locations. Meanwhile, H.G. Richardson was ready to turn in his resignation when Al Haig tried a last-ditch Hail Mary to get Richardson to stay, saying, okay, well, maybe you don't have to fire Cox and we could just do the Stennis proposal regardless with Senate approval. After a whole day of a confusing back and forth conversation, A.G. Richardson received a letter from the president which stated that Nixon would agree to the Stennis proposal, a very gracious move, but that Richardson had to direct Cox that he could not use the judicial process to obtain tapes, notes, or memorandas of a presidential conversation. Richardson felt blindsided and, quite frankly, pissed off.
Can you kind of summarize for us in today's terms, like what just happened there? Like who agreed to what?
Essentially, the U.S. Court of Appeals decision came down to say, hey, Nixon, you actually have to give over these tapes. And Nixon was like, yeah, okay, we'll try to work out a proposal. And so his team came up with this proposal that would essentially allow his team to summarize the tapes, and then they would be signed off on or validated by a third party, but probably the third party wouldn't actually listen to them. So this would all just be whatever Nixon said, essentially, which Cox said, that's a pretty unbelievably awful plan. No, I don't want that plan. And the AG also agreed with him. And well, Nixon was like, well, if you don't agree to this, it seems like we're going to have to fire you.
Dunzo.
So after that whole day of conversation, Richardson called Cox, the special prosecutor, and read him the letter, making it clear that he would not be following through with the president's order. The Nixon camp then released a 1,000-word statement from the president that outlined the Stennis proposal, saying that Richardson was the brainchild and that the Stennis and the two senators running the select committee had already approved the proposal. This was not true. Nixon also revealed that his complying through the Stennis proposal would be the end of the hunt for presidential documents, saying, I believe that by these actions I have taken today, America will be spared the anguish of further indecision and litigation about the tapes.
So selfless.
So selfless of him.
Demure.
Very demure. Very mindful of him.
Mm-hmm.
So Richardson said no to the deal. No dice. I'm not firing Cox. If you want me to fire Cox, I'm going to resign. And then on the back end, Nixon's camp sent out a statement that said, oh, by the way, Nixon's already approved the Stennis proposal, and so have the senators that are going to be involved in it. When the truth of the matter is, no one had signed off on it. In response, Cox held a press conference the next day at the National Press Club, where he laid out his position that he was not out for the president of the United States, and in fact had been somewhat hesitant to take the job, but knew someone had to do it, and that if anything, it would be good for the country. The public and the press were sympathetic. Cox's public stand had resonated with Americans across the country, which the Nixon camp did not expect. Scrambling, Haig called Richardson and told him to fire Cox once and for all. Richardson balked and said, "I can't do that. I guess I better come over and resign." The White House had begged Richardson and his deputy William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox, but both men refused. Richardson resigned, and Ruckelshaus tried to resign, only to be outright fired by Haig. Next in line to succeed Richardson and Ruckelshaus was Solicitor General Robert Bork. He agreed to fire Cox. Apparently, Bork also wanted to resign after firing Cox, but was convinced by Richardson and Ruckelshaus to stay around. Following this, the White House press secretary announced to the world that the Special Prosecution Task Force had been abolished. Down in Virginia, a White House aide had been sent to bring Cox's resignation to his actual home. This entire episode, from top to bottom of this whole Cox firing and Richardson resigning, was known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
And I'm sure the decision to do this on a weekend was very intentional. Mm-hmm. Anytime, Biden, resigned on a Sunday.
Yep. Even Friday afternoon dumps, right? Mm-hmm. So right after this announcement goes live, the FBI is told to secure the building where the task force was and was met by many attorneys who had been working there and were trying to sneak out documents. They argued that Nixon had abolished the task force but didn't actually fire them, and that they were still employed by the Justice Department and were able to continue their work. Cox's deputy, Henry Ruth, held an impromptu press conference that night at the Justice Department, where a statement from Cox was read that said, quote unquote, "Whether ours shall continue to be a government of laws and not of men is now for Congress and ultimately the American people to decide."
Twitter would be lighting up today. Can you imagine?
1,000%, yes.
Hashtag Nixon is over party trending everywhere.
The Saturday Night Massacre was a gross miscalculation on the part of the Nixon team. They had expected disapproval, but the blowback they received from the public and even lawmakers within his own party was enormous. Congress now finally seemed ready to move towards impeachment, and several resolutions of impeachment were introduced in the House. Surprisingly, though, Bork, the new AG, seemed pretty set on having the special prosecution team stay in place. He even told the attorneys that, "I'll back you up. Go to court for any tapes and documents you need, and resign if the White House gives you trouble." So overall, when I first read about Bork, I was like, this guy kind of stinks. He fired Cox. The special prosecutor surely didn't need to be fired. But then I have to remember that Bork also wanted to resign after he fired Cox, just to kind of stop the process, and then still was very willing to put his neck out on the line to say, "Hey, special prosecution, keep going after these tapes. I'll back you up."
Yeah, there's a lot of bad people in this story, and he's certainly not perfect, but he doesn't really stand out to me given a lot of the other bad actors in this case.
Fair enough, yes. Back at the courthouse, Judge Sirica moved to gather 2 grand juries working on Watergate so he could read a prepared statement to order that Nixon turn over the tapes. To everyone's surprise, Nixon's lawyer Wright responded that Nixon intended to turn over the tapes and comply in all respects. I'd also like to mention that during this time, the Yom Kippur War was happening, and Nixon was so distracted and anxious about the Watergate scandal that Henry Kissinger told Defense Secretary, CIA Director, and the Joint Chiefs Chairman that, quote unquote, "we have no functional president." And let's also consider at this time that Nixon had no VP, and quite frankly, Congress wasn't very eager to confirm Gerald Ford.
And this is why the comms team is just as important as the policy team, because even when there's a policy crisis, if your communications are up in flames, that's all anyone's going to be talking about.
Yep, and you're not going to be able to move anything.
Exactly. You will not be a functional president if you don't have your comms house in order.
1,000%.
All right, I'll hop off the soapbox now. Continue.
By the end of October, the House Judiciary Committee voted on a party-line vote to grant the chair, Peter Rodino, a Democrat from New Jersey, subpoena power. An impeachment inquiry was headed Nixon's way. Also, by October 30th, 1973, Judge Sirica was having discussions about how the White House would turn over the tapes. It was then revealed that 2 of the 9 tapes requested were gone. With all the judicial, public, and congressional pressure on the White House, the Nixon team decided they would have to appoint a new special prosecutor. The man for the job was Texas lawyer Leon Jurowski. He had been the president of the American Bar Association and had been a prosecutor for the Nuremberg trials. Both parties were seemingly happy with the choice, and Nixon's team thought he would also be more understanding to the national security angle with his past experience. Although Jaworski wasn't going to be an easy yes. He needed some job assurance. It was decided that Jaworski would have full independence and that he could only be fired with the assent of 6 of the 8 top leaders in Congress. Jaworski quickly won the respect of the rest of the task force as well, with his aggressive moves to request more tapes and documents from the Nixon team. Jaworski was playing no games. On Capitol Hill, the House approved $1 million for the Judiciary Committee's impeachment inquiry on a bipartisan 361 to 51 vote. So 2 more important things happened that November of 1973. Nixon's "I'm not a crook" speech and the revelation that a critical portion of one of the tapes had seemingly been erased. In a news conference with the Associated Press Managing Editors Association in Disney World, again, why was he there in light of all these things? So Nixon, while he was there, engaged in an hour-long Q&A session. What?
I mean, was he in Cinderella's castle?
Right. This was part of like Nixon's transparency campaign to like win him back support. But again, I have to like side eye whatever staffer was like, yeah, let's do an hour-long Q&A with all the press.
At Disney World during both international and domestic crises.
What could go wrong?
It makes me think of that Bush line, but it would be different for Nixon. Instead of, now watch this drive, it'd be like, now watch this parade. Just cut to Mickey.
Literally. Hi, guys. Harley, would you read an excerpt of this speech he gave?
I don't have a good Nixon voice. Otherwise, I would do an impression, but that's not me. Let me just say this, and I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years in public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life that I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Now, this is tough in so many ways because he did obstruct justice.
Because it's a lie.
Yeah. Just one more lie on the part of Nixon in front of all the journalists at Disney World. So
this is also why you don't want to repeat the attacks that people are using against you, because then they have a clip of you saying it. I mean, right. I am not a crook is the only thing I'd ever heard from this speech. And so if you never say what people's arguments are against you, it can never be used against you. And right. Who knows, maybe the poll line from this could have been, I've earned everything I've got, had he not repeated what the other side was saying about him.
Yeah.
During the interview.
I'm not a crook. So back to the tapes. Buswell revealed to Jaworski the day before Thanksgiving that an 18-minute chunk of conversation between Nixon and Hadelman, where they discussed Watergate, was missing. Buzzhart laid blame to Nixon's longtime, highly trusted secretary, Rosemary Woods, who had been ordered earlier to transcribe the tapes for Nixon and had admitted to a small accident where a little bit of the tape was erased. But it was surely suspicious that the tape cut out 18 whole minutes and that the tape conveniently resumed when Nixon and Hadelman had moved on to a different topic. So this prompted another public hearing in Judge Sirica's courtroom. The special prosecutor's attorney who led the questioning of Rosemary Woods was none other than Jill Vollner. And you may know her today as Jill Wine-Banks, who was just an absolute killer in the courthouse. She proved that it was unlikely, if not impossible, for Mary Rose to accidentally erase 18 minutes of the tape in the way that she described. The scientists who examined the tapes found that there were 5 stops and 9 starts, which showed that 4 of the attempts to erase the tape were erased to try again. So no matter how you spin it, Rosemary's story just did not check out. But ultimately, it was decided that the erasure was more symbolic than, I guess, damning to the investigation, because essentially there was more where that came from. On December 12th, 1973, the prosecutors received its first batch of tapes. They listened to the John Dean Nixon conversation and were baffled to learn that John Dean had been right all along. The evidence against Nixon was compounding. Now, as 1973 drew to a close, Judiciary Chairman Peter Rodino selected chief counsel for the impeachment inquiry named John Doerr, who had a long career at the Justice Department, leading cases against KKK members and protecting civil rights advocates. Throughout that final month, Doerr added more staff to his team, including none other than Hillary Rodham, who was dating Bill Clinton at the time. Bill Clinton turned down the offer to work for the committee, but said, "Hey, you should hire my girlfriend Hillary. She's pretty great." So Hillary was actually a lawyer on the Rodino committee. Isn't that crazy?
That's really interesting. I had no idea she had another life as kind of sort of a congressional staffer.
Yeah, totally. Although December saw the confirmation of Nixon's new VP, Gerald Ford, Nixon was in a bad place, and he had to decide once and for all, would he back down and resign, or would he fight to remain president? He settled on the fight option. To prove he meant business, the Nixon team hired a well-experienced trial attorney named James St. Clair to head up Nixon's team going into the new year. The addition was especially needed since Nixon's other lawyers, Buzzhart and Garment, had decided they wanted to transfer away from the case, feeling that it was a losing game and a path to an obstruction of justice charge. Can't blame them there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now we have officially made it to year 1974, and the prosecutors hit the ground running. Despite some setbacks in analyzing the tapes that had rough quality and some traces of human interference, the grand jury was allowed to listen to one of the tapes for the first time. The lawyers were elated to see that the civilians on the grand jury were just as horrified as the lawyers to hear what was on the tapes. So this is when things start to move pretty fast. So bear with me. In February 1974, Special Prosecutor Jaworski and his team presented a plan to the grand jury that they had come up with. Instead of indicting the president, the prosecutors would indict his top aides and advisors, but name Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator. This essentially meant that they thought Nixon was guilty, but they didn't yet want to prosecute him. It seems that Jaworski just didn't think it proper to indict a sitting president and wanted impeachment proceedings to go first. To that end, Jaworski and his team wanted to be able to share their findings with the House Judiciary Committee. So leaning on some legal precedent, they created this impeachment roadmap report, which listed Nixon's public statements of innocence with evidence that showed otherwise. In that same grand jury session, the grand jury also approved that Judge Sirica could release the roadmap to the House Judiciary Committee. So this is really just such like a chess game on behalf of the prosecution's team. It really is incredible. I mean, they really had to think about so many things, and not only, is it getting, quote unquote, the bad guys, but there are constitutional, executive privilege questions within this all-around this case that you have to consider.
And precedent-setting questions as well.
Totally. So finally, on March 1st, 1974, the prosecutor's office indicted John Mitchell, H.R. Hadelman, John Ehrlichman, Charles Colson, Gordon Strahan, and Kenneth Parkinson on conspiracy charges and more. The indictment also mentioned 18 unindicted co-conspirators, one of which was President Richard Nixon himself. Although for now, the public and Nixon's own team would not know this, just the grand jury. The Nixon camp's response to these subpoenas was kind of baffling because on April 29th, Nixon released 1,300 pages of conversation transcript to once again try to prove his innocence.
We know where he was April 29th.
Yeah, we sure do. The issue is that these transcripts were highly edited and just plain inaccurate. And Jaworski found that out of the 64 conversations he had requested, the Nixon camp had only transcribed, and when I say transcribed, it's in quotes, they'd only transcribed around 20 of them. And at the end of the day, the subpoena demanded the raw tapes, not the transcripts done by Nixon's own team. The public was similarly unimpressed by Nixon's transcripts, and at the very least, the conversations showed a lack of remorse and level of pettiness that shocked the nation and made the transcripts an absolute joke. In a last-ditch effort to block the subpoena for the additional tapes, Nixon's lawyer, James St. Clair, tried to use the fact that Nixon was not part of the conspiracy according to the indictment on the Watergate 7. Jaworski and his team then revealed that they had been playing chess all along, and that in fact the grand jury had named Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator. Graciously, Jaworski offered that if St. Clair could deliver 18 of the tapes, that Jaworski would drop the subpoena and delay the announcement that Nixon was an unindicted co-conspirator. One of the tapes requested was a conversation between Hadelman and Nixon on June 23rd, 1972. I discussed this conversation last episode, but it's essentially the one where Hadelman told Nixon that they could block the FBI investigation into the burglary if they got the CIA to tell the FBI to, quote unquote, stay the hell out of this. Do you remember that, Harley?
That was a very important moment in that episode too.
Yeah, smoking gun is kind of what they call the smoking gun tape. So when Jaworski's offer made it back to Nixon, Nixon himself went back and listened to the tape. Curiously, no one else on his legal team did. But Nixon came back after listening to this tape and told his team that they would not cooperate. So you know it was bad.
Yeah, they knew what was up.
On May 10th, the day after the first of the House impeachment hearings, Jaworski handed out the report in a closed-door meeting with the judge, prosecutors, and defense attorney that named Nixon as the unindicted co-conspirator. In the same meeting, Judge Sirica ordered the subpoena for the 64 tapes to be enforced. Learning from the last time the special prosecutor tried to subpoena tapes from the White House and not wanting the case to drag on for too long, Jaworski moved to have the U.S. Supreme Court review the legality of the subpoena immediately, so not let it go to the appeals court. The U.S. Supreme Court took up the case and named it the United States versus Richard M. Nixon. During this time, the House Judiciary Committee was hard at work. The staff, led by Dorr, had done almost the impossible by presenting the entire Watergate scandal as one connected storyline, starting from the very beginning and encompassing all sides of the scandal that had popped up over the last couple of years. Chairman Rodino knew that the impeachment proceedings were by nature political, but he didn't want them to be fully partisan. By establishing a clear pattern of misconduct on the part of Nixon, lawmakers from both parties were getting a full-fledged account of Nixon's disregard of legal, ethical, and moral boundaries, rendering him unfit to serve as president of the United States. On July 8th, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments for the case, and less than a month later, on July 24th, 1974, the court, in the unanimous decision, ordered Nixon to release his Oval Office tapes to investigators. While some of Nixon's staff was stunned to hear the news that it was a unanimous decision, Nixon immediately knew that he was in hot water because of the June 23rd conversation. He had Buzzhart finally listen to the tape, who, after listening, told the chief of staff, Haig, that it was over for Nixon and that Nixon ought to start thinking about his options. Just a few days later, the House Judiciary Committee advanced 2 articles of impeachment against Nixon, one for obstruction of justice, which was adopted by a vote of 27-11, and one for abuse of presidential power, which was adopted by a vote of 28-10. Nixon had lost the support of many conservative Democrats and Republicans in his own party. And Nixon's remaining supporters were shrinking fast, especially when transcripts of the June 23rd conversation were released. Judiciary Chairman Rodino even announced that the remaining no's on the impeachment articles had been flipped so that when Rodino took the articles to the House floor, the entire committee, both parties, were going to be united. The release of the smoking gun tape also made it even less likely that Nixon could count on acquittal in the Senate. Barry Goldwater reported that Nixon was only down to 12 votes that he could count on. In a cabinet meeting, George H.W. Bush, at the time head of the RNC, even told Nixon that it was time to resign. The tide had turned in the Republican Party. Seeing that resignation was near, Hadelman and Ehrlichman tried to lobby the president on a blanket pardon, but Nixon's legal team feared that this would make Americans so mad it would result in criminal proceedings against Nixon after he resigned. Finally, on August 8, 1974, 1 minute after 9 p.m., Nixon delivered his resignation speech on national television and radio. Here are some excerpts from his speech.
This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shaped the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged.
Nixon also announced that he would resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow, and that Vice President Ford would be sworn in as president at that same time. After his address, Nixon spent hours phoning old friends, employees, and advisors, saying that he was sorry he let them down. That next morning, Nixon officially signed his letter of resignation that contained one sentence. Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby resign the office of President of the United States. Sincerely, Richard Nixon. Nixon's farewell remarks were, as Jaworski described, better tailored to a president unexpectedly leaving office for far more favorable circumstances. Nixon had put some zingers in there, and as he drew to a close, said, always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself.
Sir, have you heard of a mirror? I suggest looking in one.
We should buy him a mirror. Let's give him a mirror.
Absolutely.
Immediately after, Gerald Ford was sworn in as president. Nixon's departure marked the first resignation of an American president. And just a month later, President Ford granted Nixon a pardon, a decision that made many question if Ford and Nixon had forged some kind of deal. Ford insisted that this was not the case, and that Nixon had just suffered enough, and that America did not need to see a former president behind bars.
And even if they had struck a deal, there was nothing holding Ford to that.
Right. The entirety of the Watergate scandal resulted in the conviction of 48 people for crimes that included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, perjury, burglary, wiretapping, and distributing illegal campaign literature. Those convicted included H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Dean, John Mitchell, Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, James McCord, and Charles Colson. In addition, 20 corporations ended up pleading guilty to making illegal campaign contributions.
They caught us stray there with that one.
I know. They're like, bro. In the aftermath of this, Congress moved to pass several pieces of legislation too, to prevent history from repeating itself, including the Federal Election Campaign Amendments, Freedom of Information Act amendments, the Privacy Act of 1974, the Tax Reform Act of 1976, and the Ethics in Government Act of 1978. Idaho Senator Frank Church and Representative Otis Pike also moved to create a select committee in their respective chambers to investigate what other illegal and reprehensible acts U.S. intelligence agencies had undertaken without congressional knowledge. These committees would end up revealing a lot of nonsense that the CIA and the FBI had been up to, including, I don't know, experimenting on LSD on Americans. Ever heard of it?
No, that one just got swept under the rug.
Yeah, no one, yeah. Historians also see the impact of Watergate on the press. Journalist Teddy Wright wrote, quote unquote, and this is the quote we're going to end on, if Nixon had bequeathed to his presidential successors a permanently hostile news system, he has cursed them all.
Ooh, ominous.
Yeah, and that, my friends, is part 4 of the Watergate scandal.
Part 4 of 4.
Part 4 of 4, that's it, you guys. You did it, you made it through.
Well, thank you for taking this on, because first of all, it was a beast, but also there's a ton of details that I had no idea about involving Watergate. And also, I don't know, I feel kind of weird hearing those names read of everyone who was convicted, knowing that ultimately the man at the center of it all would be pardoned.
Right?
Granted, I mean, he faced a historical embarrassment, but no actual responsibility.
Yeah. He was able to, write memoirs, be a political commentator, all that. So it's really interesting. Yeah. 48 convictions. 48.
A lot. Although I have to remember, because this is a true crime podcast, usually we're talking about life imprisonment, and that is not what's happening here. We're talking months and years. But
yeah, still
crazy.
48 is a lot. And with that, I think we can finally close the close the lid on the Watergate scandal. Harley, do you want to gavel us out?
Of course.